Hello, welcome back to CSL 101. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how you navigate through DDS, Pro Basketball 3, and then how you do a little bit of the general roster management that you'd expect with a basketball franchise game. So we've assumed you've logged into this point and you've got to your team. This is the first screen that comes up. The first thing I guess to point out before we talk about some of the buttons up the top here are just to sort of talk about the flashing phone icon. Just completely ignore that. It's irrelevant for a multiplayer sim. If you're playing this single player, it's a little bit more relevant because it'll talk about the owner giving you objectives and things like that. But for the purposes of CSL, just ignore that. And the same with the email icon that's flashing. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I'm joined here today with our Commissioner Miles, who's with me for all of these videos, and I'm sure he'll chime in on certain points. But to begin with, I guess the first thing to talk about is some of these icons up the top here. So you'll see as I'm highlighting over each one, it kind of tells you what it is, but we'll go through some of them. So the first thing is you have the Play Sim button, which will bring up the games that are happening on that day. You can obviously navigate through a little bit, but obviously you know in your franchise login, you can't sim the games because obviously that's done through the simmer, the elusive simmer on the CSL forums. But you can kind of see your schedule a little bit, who you're playing, what's coming up. It also gives you a nice little playoff screen when the playoffs do happen, little bracket. But we'll ignore that for now. Obviously,
and real quick before you move on to the next screen, last video we showed you how to get into the commissioner page, and so you may be thinking to yourself, "Oh, I can log as commissioner and play out the games and see the future." Again, just want to point out we do randomize the ratings for the file we send out, so you absolutely could sim the games, and all be completely useless because all the players have ratings that do not reflect their ratings, their actual ratings.
As usual, our commissioner chimes in with valid piece of information to stop the elusive cheaters that we may have appearing in the Sim League. So the next button you'll get is the Office button, which takes you back to this screen that we saw when we logged in. We won't necessarily talk about that in too much detail. I mean, a lot of this, Miles, I don't know about you, but a lot of this I don't necessarily use, and we'll talk a little about philosophies later on. But I mean,
yeah, I click exactly two buttons on that screen, the philosophy one and the send MP one. And we're going to go over both of those a little bit later as we show you how to submit your depth chart.
Yeah. I mean, the key dates are pretty handy because it does give you an overview of the schedule within within the game to see when things like trade deadlines are and when the training camps are. But obviously, this is all kind of communicated through the forum anyway. And obviously, those dates don't reflect real life dates, just stating the obvious. So the next button we'll have is the standings button, which, as you would expect, gives you your standings. You can look by division, by conference, East and West. And if you're really interested, you can look at the CSL Development League, which is not worth anything, so I wouldn't bother. Moving on to the league leaders, probably quite a valuable one if you're a new GM joining the league and you just want to get a snapshot of some of the players putting up the numbers, really. You can get a quick snapshot of that here. You can obviously see, your standard things, your points, your rebounds, your blocks, assist, steals, field goal percentage. And if you really want to, you can go and see the complete full list of leaders. And within here, you can get more of a breakdown. So if you want to just look at rookies only, non-rookies, positions, particular things, you can obviously do that here. And I'll leave that to you guys to have a look at your own heart's content. So moving on, the next thing is the association leaders, which is, obviously the league leaders, but in terms of the franchises. And similar sort of screen, gives you a quick snapshot breakdown. You can go down and click into it and, look at all different kinds of stats, look at team totals, opposition totals, statistical totals, if you really want to. Again, might be useful to give a flavor of, what teams are necessarily doing well, not doing well, what your team's not necessarily doing that well. But obviously, as anyone who is a GM in a basketball sim league, these stats don't necessarily show everything because there's other considerations.
Yeah, well, they don't show everything. I do actually think these are very helpful for a team figuring out what they're good at and what they're not good at. Because using the team totals and opposing team totals, you can see perhaps, are you winning the turnover battle? Are you winning the rebound battle? are you holding opposing teams to low field goal percentages? It just allows you to look a little bit deeper and see like, all right, like what are our strengths currently? What are our weaknesses currently?
Yeah, and I'm not sure necessarily whether there's a regular article that comes out on the forum now, but you'll see guys put up other statistical numbers based off of some of this and based off of some of the other data that might be beneficial as well to have a look at. But yeah, it does give you a good snapshot. So moving on to the league finances, this gives you a quick breakdown of what the payroll is for your team. Obviously you can look at this against the CBA to see whether you're over or under the cap, but it does give you a nice snapshot here of where you are. Luxury tax, don't worry about that because no one pays luxury tax. We don't own the franchises. And then it gives you an idea of your payroll going into next year if you were to renounce every single player that was on your team. That is renounceable. And you can get some nice little attendance figures. Fairly interesting if you want that immersive experience to see is your team performing well and setting out? Are they bottoming out? It gives you a bit of flavor to add to articles. I find I've used it a couple of times. I don't think in the CSL, but in other leagues to sort of show that my team's not necessarily performing very well. The attendance is dwindling. To try and give that sort of immersive flavor. Miles, I don't know if you've got anything else you want to add to this screen, but.
No, I mean a lot of these numbers, especially the cap numbers and stuff, you can find on your own team page. This is one thing that I want to always be able to tell you guys is things that you can use and things that people don't really use as much. And I'll be honest, I don't ever click on this page.
No, I tend to. Yeah, for me personally, just my advice, I use a basic spreadsheet for my salary figures because it means you can manipulate the numbers, work out with trades and things, how your position looks, and what your situation is going forward. I tend to use that rather than this page itself because this is just a fixed figure. Mm-hmm. The next thing that's on here is the Almanac. I'll be honest with you, I don't ever look at this because it doesn't really tell you much. If you're really interested in records or player history, we have no one in the Hall of Fame. If you want to find out who the MVP was for like the past couple of years.
This is in-game stuff. So actually, we have a historical section on the site with this kind of stuff. So if you are interested in looking back on it, there is a CSL Almanac on the forum. You can see historical awards, historical champions, historical standings, all that stuff can be found on the site. And it's all accurate as we do our own award voting.
Yeah. And so the next one is the draft class. This is probably the biggest one to flag on this list apart from roster. Don't look at this.
Don't look at this.
As Miles is yelling, don't look at this.
Don't waste your time.
This is just not real. We in the CSL upload our own draft class, and you'll see there's a whole draft section on the forum to tell you who the players are that are up and coming. We'll have a separate video talking about that at some point, but don't look at this screen. Whatever you do, don't base your picks and value off of this because this is not real. Next one is staff. So there's a bit of an interesting one on staff, I guess. So this gives you a sense of who your coaches are. There's mixed opinion, Miles, isn't there, in the league about the actual impact of coaches in this version of DDS?
For sure. I like to think coaches have some form of impact, but I have absolutely no idea how much of an impact they actually have. Most people seem to agree that the player development rating and the strategy ratings are probably the only ones that really matter. So take that for what you will.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, again, we'll do a video on the CBA, but you'll see all the coaches' salaries are the same, and we have some fixed limits on that because there is a bug in terms of the franchise ID in the background that would make it unfair if you were trying to sign coaches. So there is a fixed amount of salary you can offer for a particular coach and position, but we'll talk about that another time. We'll go over the roster one a little bit later, but the next one to talk about probably is the team schedule. So this gives you a sense of the full schedule of your team and performances.
Yep. And you can double click on any of these results and it'll pull up the box score for that game. So if we were to look at, what is this, Detroit and Charlotte, you double click it and boom, there's the box score right there with all the results.
Yeah. And this gives you a nice sense of how much weaker the Eastern Conference is, I think, Miles. Pistons doing very well there. So moving on. So the team info page, I never look at this.
Useless.
If you really want to know who the file has assigned as your owner, and random stuff that might add some flavors to your article writing or your whatever it is you're doing for media. It might be interesting in that sense, but it's not worth anything else. Team history, very similar to the Almanac. I wouldn't really worry about looking at this too much, but similar kind of breakdowns it gives you there.
Yeah, the only thing I use for the team history is for when writing articles. If I want to talk about teams' draft history, if I want to talk about like how they performed in a certain season, I can go to the season recap. If I want to look at the transactions a team has made, it's kind of helpful if you're wanting to do kind of a historical piece. But other than that, it's really, yeah.
Not much to say on that. And then you have the search button, which will load up. I'll be honest with you, I use this very rarely.
Actually, Chris, because the search is a pop-up, we actually can't see it in the video.
Okay.
But it's a little pop-up with like drop-down menus, filters, and all that stuff. It's semi-useful. It helps you find if you're looking for a certain player, maybe someone who has good rebounding, but also a good shot blocker and is at least 6'9" or whatever. Like you can kind of do that to narrow down the list, but I wouldn't get too caught up in using this feature.
No.
But it can help with like the beginnings of maybe finding a trade partner or something like that.
Yeah. So Miles, you'd have to tell me if you can see this. Can you see the email?
I can see the email.
Okay, good.
I wish we couldn't because it's useless.
as exactly as Miles said. Don't use this. Don't ever look at it. Don't waste your time with it. Really. We don't use any of the background information. You can see here that on Denver, Tyler Stone is obviously playing very well because they're on it to comment, but none of this feeds through into the actual league file, so don't worry about that. And it doesn't feed through into player impact at all, so just ignore that. And then we're finally kind of back to the roster screen. So we'll talk about the roster screen, and we'll come back and talk about philosophy and sending the multiplayer file later on. But we'll dive straight into the roster, Miles. And you can see if you click in here, instantly gives you quite a nice snapshot of the players on your roster to begin with. You can quite easily see some of the the basic ratings in terms of position, age. If you want to know what college they went to, I don't know really whether people care about that. You can see the salary, which is quite nice, just to give you a quick feel of how much they're earning. You can see here though, Miles, that John Wall has a plus sign next to him, and that means that he's injured.
Yeah, unfortunately he is. And if we want to see what that injury is, at the top there's a button that says injury report, or you can double click him and open the player card. Either one is fine. But along the top there on the far right, there's a button that says injury report, and this shows you your injury. So John Wall's got a sore hip. He's going to have to tough it out, deal with it. Same with Kennedy Meeks. Just put your hips together or something, boys. So you have to figure it out.
Yeah, and it's quite nice that John Wall's injured for my case at the moment. But so
one thing to look at on this screen is right above the names, there's an options button with some grayed out buttons, some non-grayed out buttons. You can't really do anything with these buttons because it doesn't feed into the main file. So if you want to sign a free agent, if you want to cut a player, if you want to sign a player to the D League, if you want to renounce a player during free agency, these are all things that you have to say on the forum. So don't try to use these buttons. Don't worry about offering an extension because we don't do extensions. You can use the offer trade button to help you sort out a trade. But again, all these things must be posted on the forum for them to become official.
Yeah. And I guess it's probably worth pointing out that the sign free agent button is pretty helpful because it just brings up all the free agents that are available. So you can quickly, this gives you a nice snapshot of who is available if you want to sign someone. Just worth pointing out on here, though, if I scroll right the way down, you'll see there's a lot of players that have ZZZ. These are not star players.
Or ZZZ for those of us who use the normal alphabet.
ZZZ. We don't use American. So, yeah, as Miles pointed out, ZZZ, ZZZ. These players, essentially the way the league is worked. These will be old draft players that the DDS engine will have generated but obviously we don't use those, so we completely flatline them out, and you're not allowed to sign them. You shouldn't sign them anyway because their ratings are terrible, but just to point out that there's quite a few of them, ignore them. Everyone else in here is obviously available to grab. They're all obviously still free agents, but at this point in the season, they're probably not worth looking at. Perhaps towards the start of the season, they're more worth looking at. But it's quite a handy little button to click to kind of search through players. So we'll go back, and it brings us back to our roster screen. And then the next thing we have, if you see up the top here, we've got lots of different options. We've talked about the injury report, but the next one along is the ratings. Miles, I don't know if you want to necessarily talk about the ratings for your team.
Yeah, so not necessarily for my team, but in general. So earlier we mentioned, and on the previous video, I mentioned the ratings are randomized. However, if you're logged into a team page and you're looking at ratings, whether here or in the free agent screen or anywhere, these ratings are your scouts' approximation of their ratings. And so the longer a player has been in the league, the more times he's been scouted, the more accurate it is. And so you'll find sometimes that your scouts are fairly accurate. But you looking at this screen, you're getting an approximation of what their real ratings are. There's a lot of different things on here. Going from left to right, FGI is generically they're shooting inside, and FGJ is they're shooting outside. It is not perfect. Most people don't really look at it and instead use their actual shooting percentages, but that's what those ratings do mean. FT is their free throw shooting. This one's not perfect because, for example, Andre Drummond has a 10 for free throw shooting, all the way at the bottom there, but he doesn't shoot 10% on free throws. So it's not a perfect one-to-one representation there, but it generally shows you how well they do on free throw shooting. The next column is SCR. That's their scoring rating. It's both how good they are at creating a shot for themselves, as well as how willing they are to shoot the ball. So just because someone has a good scoring rating doesn't mean they're a good scorer. It really just means they're good at attempting shots. The next few are pass and handle. And obviously these are very important more to guards because it's how good they are at passing the ball and how good they are at handling the ball and not turning it over. The next two are offensive rebounding and defensive rebounding. Very straightforward how good they are at those two things. This next one is defense. This is basically the way it's kind of seen is this is how good they are at like the basic defense, like moving their feet, keeping, contesting shots. Basically it just kind of helps, how good they are at fundamental defense. Then we have block and steal, and this is how good they are at blocking shots and stealing the ball. DRFL stands for draw foul. So the higher this button is, the more times they're going to go to the free throw line and draw fouls on opposing players. And then we have DI. This is discipline. And so basically what this one means is it's like how likely a player is to not foul, how likely they are to not take dumb shots and play within the offense. Basically, it's how disciplined are you as a basketball player. The next one is IQ, how smart you are as a basketball player. Now, there's different people have different opinions on how this rating works or if this means anything at all, because we're not really positive. But most people tend to think, at least I think most people think that this just kind of the better the IQ is, the better the player is at using their skills. You want to be smart. You don't want dumb players. And then finally, you've got EN, which stands for endurance. And this just is how much stamina does your player have? The higher the number, the more they can play on the court. As you can see a little bit above with Andre Drummond, who's currently selected, he's got 93 endurance. So he's got pretty good endurance. But a little bit above, Jason Tatum only has 83 endurance. And so I have to be very careful with the kind of playing time I can give him, because he'll get tired very quickly on the court if I let him stay out there too long. So that's and then finally is the overall, and you can ignore this one entirely.
Yeah, so I think it's a couple of things that's worth pointing out as well, Miles, is that the ratings are from 1 to 100, so you're not going to see somewhere with like 150. Obviously, when you start looking at this in a bit more detail, there'll be some ratings which you'll very rarely see 100 on, some where you'll see 100 a lot of the time. And as Miles pointed out, the endurance is changes from player to player. we tend to see that younger rookie players have a lower endurance and they build that up through the cycle of their careers. You imagine they're getting used to the hardships of playing basketball for 82 games, whereas more experienced players in the prime of their career will have higher endurance. And then as they start to decline, like LaMarcus Aldridge here, you might see the endurance start to drop off again as they get older and their legs start to fall apart.
Hey, LaMarcus Aldridge has young legs. Don't you dare insinuate otherwise.
So should we move on to the stats screen?
Absolutely.
So there's an awful lot of information here on the stats screen to kind of digest, really. The first thing that will come up is this screen, which is your stats one. This just gives you a very simple snapshot of some of the basic stats that you would expect to see in a traditional box score, really. So games played, games started from left to right, minutes played. These are all obviously on average per season per game, as you can see from the highlights here. You can look at postseason, but we haven't had a postseason yet this year. So you then have your points, your offensive rebounds, defensive rebounds, your total rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, turnovers, assists to turnovers, which is a simple metric from you looking at your assists and your turnovers, and then that's your metric. Your personal fouls, your number of charges, and your technicals.
And you can ignore the last two because they don't do anything, and no one is positive if the charges button even works. Because if you look down at Thomas Robinson, he's played one game and supposedly has drawn 17 charges or committed 17 charges. Either way, that ain't right.
Yeah, so I always think of this one as charges they've received rather than been given. But I guess the nice thing about this screen and the stat screen in general is you have a nice little box here of the breakdowns of the acronyms, which is quite handy if you forget them. And you can obviously look per game, per 36, and totals for this, which is quite handy if you're looking at across the board. So if we move on to stats 2, this gives you a little bit. Yeah,
this is an important screen. This is definitely an important screen because this breaks down where shooters are good at shooting the ball. And that's important to know because sometimes you have players like John Wall. He's shooting 41%, but now I can see that he's shooting from 3-pointer a certain percentage. He's shooting go to the not the next one. The next one's free throws, but after that is inside. This is shots in the paint. So obviously that's where his biggest strength is because he's shooting almost 56% inside the paint. And then the last one is mid-range jumpers. And clearly he's not having a great season shooting the ball from mid-range. So this is a really great screen for you to see exactly where players' strengths and weaknesses are in terms of shooting the ball.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big one for new GMs entering the league is in terms of if you look at this just on the HTML, which we'll talk about in another video, you'll just see this one, this field goal percentage. And if you're just using that to base your assessment off of players, you're missing quite a lot of information there that's quite handy. So you'll just see the field goal and a 3-point, but you won't see this inside jumpers, which is probably quite vital if you're looking at certain players, as Miles pointed out.
And obviously free throw percentage, which is also very straightforward.
Yeah, of course. And then final one is stats 3. So, I mean, this in combination with stats 2 are probably the two most important screens if you're looking at player performance, really, in my opinion. So, the breakdowns here, but you've got essentially your on and off metrics, which, if people don't necessarily know about that, Google it because it's pretty straightforward. But I don't know about you, Miles, but I don't tend to look at those.
It's kind of tough just because while on and off are good metrics and they do serve a purpose, it's difficult because we don't get to see like how the games flow when players are in the game, and sometimes a player has a good on metric, but that's just because he shares the court with your best player a lot. So there's a lot of noise that goes into on-off metrics. It's not always perfect.
Yeah. Then next one you've got the drives stopped and drives faced. So imagine player driving to the basket. The engine essentially assigns that this player is trying to stop them, and this is how many per attempt they stop. This is how many they face. So you tend to see that, as you can probably see with John Wall here, guards, backcourt players tend to face more drives because they tended to drive into the paint. than someone like Andre Drummond, who will just live in the paint basically. Although he's taken quite a lot of drives actually this year. You must have quite a leaky backcourt, Miles. But
my defense is not great. That's for sure.
Interesting.
But if you look at this, right, John Wall and Alex Caruso, they're two of my point guards. John Wall stops 92% of the drives that come his way. And so he does a great job of making sure players don't get past him. However, Alex Caruso only stops 47% of the drives that come his way. So when Caruso's on the court, the other team has an easier time getting to the basket around Alex Caruso. So that goes to show just how strong your defense is when certain players are on the court. And that's true for all the players. You know, you go down the list and you can see how well, you know, your wings are stopping drives, how well your big men are stopping drives. It's true for all the players. Anytime the opposing player is trying to drive to the basket and your player is trying to stop him, you'll see it show up here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next one you've got is the turnovers forced, which is pretty straightforward. How many turnovers that person forces per game. You can see John Wall is fairly good at that, and so is James Young. And you see, surprisingly, Andre Drummond is. And so you might necessarily think that turnovers forced is just the ability to steal the ball, and it not necessarily is. It's the ability for that person to force the opposition into, you know, giving over possession, of, you know, forcing the ball out of bounds, whatever it is, giving away possession. And that can be a multitude of factors. So key thing to point out is it can be any position that can be quite good at that, and it can be for different factors.
The next one is very, very important. It's points allowed and shots faced, and then that metric is just points allowed divided by shots faced. And the reason this is important is because it shows how well your players contest opposing shots. You definitely want this number to be below 1. For big men, you know, like a 0.8 is elite. Sometimes you'll even see 0.7. That's like otherworldly. But generally speaking, if it's, you know, 1 is kind of what I consider average, and anything below 1 is you're starting to get into, hey, this guy might be a good defender territory. And if it's above 1, that guy sucks at defense. So that's why Maxi Esho doesn't play very much, because he doesn't play any defense.
Yeah, and you can see that. I mean, I'm not sure how many minutes he's played for you, Miles, but just to give people a flavour, obviously he doesn't face many drives. He doesn't, you know, stop many. He doesn't force any turnovers. He allows an insane amount of points per shot faced, 1.6, which is crazy. So he's not a particularly great defender. As Miles pointed out, that's probably why he never plays for the Denver Nuggets. So looking at the next one, so you've got a couple of things here which make up the final number, which is the number of touches that person has, which is very, very much strategy dependent. So if you're, you know, you'd expect the point guard to have the most touches, because in the DDS engine, they're the one that's designated to bring the ball up the court. You can't reassign that in DDS3. So they'll have the most amount of touches. And then it tends to depend on pace and strategy, but you'll kind of see who has the ball the most, really. So you can see here for the Denver Nuggets, John Wall obviously has it quite a lot. James Young also has the ball quite a lot. And the post players don't tend to have it as much as you might see with some other teams. So next one you have is your turnovers per touch. So this is just a basic metric showing you per person to touch, how often do they turn the ball over. Surprisingly, the Denver Nuggets are not too bad at that, actually, looking across the board, apart from Alex Len, who's just awful. But
this one is a good one to look at, because you may look at a player's turnovers per game and think, oh man, this player turns the ball over way too much. But if you look at his turnovers per touch, you realize, well, actually, it's just because he has the ball every single possession. So, you know, you think real life, like a guy like James Harden, who's committing almost, I think, more than 4 turnovers and maybe close to 5 turnovers a game a lot, but it's not as bad as it looks because he has the ball on every single possession. And that's why something like turnovers per touch is important. And similarly, the next one, assists per touch, same thing. You know, you may look at a player who doesn't have a lot of assists, but he gets a lot of assists per touch. It's just because he doesn't touch the ball enough. So it helps you see how good a player really is when it comes to taking care of the ball and distributing the ball.
Yeah, and then the final metric you get on this screen is the efficiency metric, which has its pros and cons and its major flaws. But, you know, if you want to find more about efficiency ratings, you can Google it and you can find the formula for it. But I think the standard thing, Miles, is anything above 15 is normally deemed pretty good for this, I think. But anything below is deemed sort of below average. I'm not sure if that necessarily directly correlates across the CSL, but that's the NBA version of it. But I mean,
so I think you're actually thinking of PER, which is on a different screen and is a different metric. I don't pay attention to efficiency at all. This one here is not something I look at. I don't really understand it, and I've never really needed to.
Okay. Okay, cool. So that gives you a flavor of the stats screen. We can move on to the contract screen now, which you can see is quite a nice little breakdown of your salaries across the board for each year. You can see instantly what their free agency year is. And there's a couple of things which are interesting to point out here. So you'll see down on this sort of right-hand side, there's different options with brackets. And you may see there's a couple of players here that have got those brackets on their contract. So what these essentially mean are different types of agreements with those contracts. So the first one here is the player option. So if that's assigned to a contract for that person on that particular year that their contract ends, it means that that player has an option to pick up that contract. So for example, if John Wall had a P here instead of a T, then he would have the opportunity to cash in that 16.8 million for that year and stay with the Denver Nuggets. If he didn't, and there was no bracket, then he would have to take that contract. So this is like, for example, in real life, if a player's earning what they deem under market value or the salary's ballooned up or whatever, they might opt out of a player option to take more money or to secure more money longer term. The team option is the other one, which is pretty straightforward. It's just the opposite. It means that in this case, Miles and the Denver Nuggets can pick up John Wall's option for 2023. Let's hope he doesn't, because that would be great because I can nab him then. The next one is an X. I don't know whether we necessarily see that anymore in CSL. Is that still allowed, Miles? The early termination option?
No, we don't do early termination options.
So ignore that. We don't use that. And then the other ones are aspects you'll see in free agency. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different types of things here when we talk about free agency in a later video. But restricted free agency essentially means that person can have his contract that he's agreed matched by the host team. Qualifying offer means that person is eligible for that to be able to have his contract matched. And free agent obviously means that person's salary there can be renounced and he can become a free agent. So looking across the screen, the other thing that's helpful to know is the bird aspect here. So for those of you who haven't necessarily come across this before, this is bird rights. So as a team keeps a player under contract for a period of time, or if they trade for that player and keep their bird rights, the more bird rights you have on a player basically means that over a certain number of years, I can't remember the exact number, you can essentially offer that person a contract when his contract expires over the salary cap.
We'll go over this more when we do the off-season free agency video.
Just give you a flavor. So for example, John Wall here, Miles, if he picks up that team option and goes to 2024, when John Wall becomes a free agent, Miles, providing he's under the hard cap, we'll explain that later on, he can re-sign John Wall for the maximum amount that he's eligible for. Anything else you want to say on this screen, Miles, or should we move on to the depth chart?
No, we've covered what is needed to know here on the contract screen. Okay,
so the depth chart.
So actually, Chris, we're going to do this whole section in a separate video because that way when people want to look at this, they can see it all in one tight video. So we're going to go ahead and actually we're going to skip ahead to the team stats so that people can see this screen, which is, again, very similar to the team leaders and the when we were looking earlier, the league leaders. There is one important stat here in the team stats that's different, though, and that's the points per 100 possessions. This is your how many points your team scores per 100 possessions. So this is pace adjusted, how good your team is on offense. The top teams here are the best teams offensively, and the bottom teams here are the worst teams offensively. and you don't see that stat anywhere else.
Yeah, and it's quite a helpful one to see where your team stacks on here. So we'll just scroll through, but you can kind of see a flavour for it. Quite a handy one again to combine to get a snapshot of how your team looks. And then the other thing I wanted to point out, Miles, in terms of it's quite handy for a new GM coming in. It's just this bottom screen here. I know probably the experienced GMs are saying they don't necessarily always look at this, but if you just want a snapshot of your team and how it's performing and where they're ranking with things, down here gives you a really nice snapshot of it. If you're looking at your leaders on your team, your team stats, your opposition stats, and where you rank in the CSL against all the other 30 teams. So it gives you quite a nice, quick, instant snapshot of what you're doing well, what you're not necessarily doing as well.
Right. And in the theme of these stats, there's one more place that's important to look at stats, and that's back on the home screen. At the bottom of the home screen, if you've logged into your team page properly with the password, there are magazines. And most of the magazines are useless, but there's one that's actually not at all useless, and that's this League Metrics magazine. And unfortunately, it's a pop-up, so we can't see it. Yeah, sorry, Chris. It's not showing up on our window here.
Bear with me. I will fix this. Give me a moment. Can you see it now?
There we go. Absolutely. So once you select a team, you'll see these metrics pop up. Now, we're not going to go into what all these metrics mean because all of them are Googleable. And you can find out exactly what they mean and what they represent. But this gives you a snapshot of the different things that that your team, like more stats than what you even see on those other stat pages. And it can give you a better idea of how good your players are performing this year.
Yeah, it's quite handy to see this. You'll see there's the PR in there as well that we may have mismentioned earlier, but it gives you a quick snapshot, and I think that kind of covers it for general DDS and stats, really, Miles. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think this is a great place for any GM, whether you're just starting out or you've been with the league a long time and need to know more about your team. I check these pages all the time. This is the kind of stuff that I do when I take the time to really sit down and see what do I need to improve on. All those pages we just looked at, that's the stuff that I look at.